The church has been told that if you pay your tithe, you open the windows of heaven, you pour out blessing to you. You will not even have enough place
But
to
can
keep
I be
it.
honest with you? So many tithers, 90% tithers have room in their houses that has not been filled.
Hi guys, and welcome back to the Truth Speaker TV. So today we're going to get into a controversial issue in the church. Should we be tithing? Should we not tithe? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And hit that notification bell so that you guys are going to be notified whenever I upload a video. Let's get into it.
Following from this conversation, you used to be a believer in tithing. The general principle of tithing is that it is a commandment of God from the Bible. It was first done by Abraham to Melchizedek. It was expected to sustain and promote Abraham's wealth. It has been used by pastors to say that the devourer will be rebuked for your sake. Did you say some of these things? Did you used to say some of these things?
Now, this is the foundation you need to understand about me. When I came into the ministry, learning from those that were ahead of me. So whatever they taught, I taught. Whatever they did, I did. As a young pastor growing, I didn't check the Bible for myself. I just copied from what I saw them do.
You didn't read the Bible?
I read, but not with the lenses that I was supposed to read with. Because all I knew was what I was taught. But I grew in ministry. And then I looked at the book again and I began to check some things. And I discovered some.
So you preached the pro-tithe message before?
Oh yes, I did.
And you told people
And
to
I preached
bring their
it
tithe to the
very
church?
radically and asked people to pay their tithes.
Did people come to complain to you in those days that they were paying their tithe and they were not seeing results?
Oh, some of them, myself inclusive, I was paying my tithe.
And you were not seeing results?
Yes, I was paying my tithe.
When you say you're not seeing results, what does it mean?
Again, so what is results? What's your definition of
Because
results?
it says the church has been told that if you pay your tithe, you open the windows of heaven, you pour out blessing to you. You will not even have enough place
But
to
can
keep
I be
it.
honest with you? So many tithers, 90% tithers have room in their houses that has not been filled. So
You
it's
mean
either
90% of tithers have not received that blessing?
their houses are not filled to overflowing like Malachi promised.
But the blessing of the tithe, is it only money? He said, rebuke the devourer for your sake.
And
that's
he
not
will,
money.
he will give you blessings
Yes.
that you will not have enough store.
Yeah, but the rebuke the
keep
devourer
them
is
in.
not money. So
But
maybe
you don't
you
need to
didn't see
tithe.
money.
You don't need to tithe.
To be told, many churches either do so, one, out of ignorance, not knowing what the purpose of the tithe is for, or in some cases, let's just be honest, out of greed. The issue is, though, what does that do for you? Is there a danger? So before we go into it, let's go ahead and think about what the tithe is for. The tithe simply stands for a tenth. A tenth of what? Well, it is a tenth of what you have produced. Now, obviously, in the Old Testament, it could be, and for the most part, it would be produce, animals, what have you. And there was a need for it to be done. It was given as a command to the Jews under the law.
So it was given as a command to the Israelites, right? Under the law.
But the point and purpose of it was for a tithe for the land, a tithe for the temple, a tithe for the Levites. Now, depending upon which scholar you're talking to, you might find that there's either 3 tithes or 2 tithes. Because of that, we're not going to really get into it because the purpose of the tithe under the old covenant is not something that we need to worry about. Why? Because it's not for us. The tithe has never been given as a command to anyone in the New Testament.
The Old Testament teaches tithing and the New Testament teaches grace giving.
Okay, so this is something that I've learned while studying the Bible, taught to me by my pastor. When you see something in the Old Testament, right, and it's not repeated in the New Testament, that means your focus should not be on practicing that, right? It's no longer a requirement, if you want to say that. But if you see something that is repeated in both the Old and New Testament, or sometimes it's repeated more than twice, that is the Holy Spirit stressing that thing to you, whatever it is, that it must be done, right?
Speaking of applying a passage incorrectly, one of the passages classically that you'll hear oftentimes in churches, really as a means to bring about guilt, is this passage in Malachi 3. Let's start in verse 8. It says, will a man rob God? Well, the obvious answer is yes. If a man gets an opportunity to, he probably will. But in this case, this is not speaking to us, it's speaking to the Jews. He says, yet you are robbing me, but you say, how? How have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings, which is why you see oftentimes or sometimes in churches, you'll see them combine the two, tithes and offerings. a tenth of what they have produced. It says, you are cursed with the curse, for you are robbing me, the whole nation, of you.
Okay, so I have a quick question. Why would God say you're robbing me, right, in tithes and offering? And why would he say you're under a curse, your whole nation, because you're robbing me? So are we under a curse, or is this message truly in fact for the Israelites during that time? And which nation is being spoken of in this text? And why are churches getting this wrong in their teachings?
The problem is this just was not for us as Gentiles. This is for the Jews. Now, has that purpose been reiterated in the New Testament? No, it has not. Now, people are going to say, well, what about Jesus? Jesus brings this up. Well, when Jesus brings it up, he's not commanding them to pay tithes. There's two times that I can think of when someone brings up tithes. First time is in Matthew 23, as well as also this story is also reiterated in Luke, and then also with the young man who says that I pay tithes twice a week in order to show that he keeps the law. But we don't see Jesus saying that you must do so. Look what he says in Matthew 23:23. He says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Why? For you tithe mint and dill and cumin and have neglected the weighty provisions of the law. So in this case, Jesus is not saying you must tithe.
That the one that bled and died on the cross, if he said you ought to give 10%, we still have to think about it. Okay, so let me put it another way. If Jesus said it, that you ought to tithe, in the New Testament, in red.
Now, under the old covenant, in this time, this dispensation, the Jews were required to do so because the need for it was still there. However, that's going to change in a little bit. And what we're going to notice is going forward, at the establishment of the church, there is no command to pay the tithe. However, someone's going to say, well, what about Abraham? The tithe was in existence before the law. Again, you can pay a tithe. You can pay any percentage that you want. You can pay 5%. You can pay 13%. If you pay 10%, what is that called? A tithe. There's an actual name to a tenth, which is a tithe. That's literally what it means. Abraham gives a tithe to Melchizedek. Remember in Genesis 14:20, he says, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he gave him a tenth of all. This Abram giving a tithe to Melchizedek. Was Abraham required to do so? We don't know. The Bible doesn't say that he was forced to do so. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. It doesn't say. And so because he gave a tenth, that means that, well, the tithe was in existence. Well, the term tithe was around, 10% was around at the time, but there was no command that we know of. And that's the key point, that we know of. We don't have a command that we know of to pay the tithe. And if there were such a command, it was not a command for us to follow. There's a such thing as primary application and secondary application. So primary application means that if it's for us, God would have made it clear and we would have to apply this to us. The primary application would be not just for them, but also for us. And so in this case, we don't see that. We don't see that with Abram. We don't see that with the Jews. That is not us. That's not the dispensation that we're in. What we do find, though, is that the disciples at the first day of the week began collecting offerings. Why? So they can have all things in common. On the first day of the week, this is 1 Corinthians 16:2. On the first day of the week, each of you is to put aside and save as he may prosper, so that no collection may be made when I come. In other words, as he comes, he's going to pick up so that other people in the body can also have who aren't doing as well. But he says to do so on the first day of the week so that when he comes, it was just out of convenience. Now, was it a command to do it on the first day of the week? Not necessarily, but he's saying to put it aside as you save, as he may prosper. Notice what's missing: an actual amount, an actual percentage. And so we cannot say that there's a command to do so. Now, as a matter of fact, we see them wanting to kind of bring money in so that the body can be blessed, the running of the ministry can be taken care of. As a matter of fact, Agabus in Acts comes down and says that there's going to be a famine, and so we should have this collection so that other people can be taken care of during this famine. And so you kind of see the principle of this, kind of being even put out. But again, there is no percentage, no tithe, no percentage that's given.
The Old Testament teaches tithing and the New Testament teaches grace giving. The bottom line is that nowhere in the New Testament is there a set percentage on how much we should give, because it's important for us to give with the right attitude, not necessarily telling us to give a certain amount. We should always be growing in our giving and not just seek to end our giving whenever we get to 10%. Now, with that being said, if you want to use 10% as a goal for your giving to start, that's a good start, but God's not going to curse you if you give 9%, and you should always seek to try to give more.
I agree with bringing your offerings into the church. However, the offering is not to fund the pastor's lifestyle, pay for his vacation, pay his students' private school fees, buy him a private jet, buy him a private island, a fleet of luxury cars, never repeat in an outfit like the flashy bishop that just got arrested for fraud. You know what I mean? The money's supposed to be helping the people, the members in the church. And whatever outreach program like the church wants to have, right? I'm in support of all of that.
Time that we see that this is commanded is in the old covenant where they're supposed to give, such as in Leviticus 27:30 says, thus all the tithe of the land, of the seed of the land, or of the fruit of the tree is the Lord's. It's holy to the Lord. This is their command. This is to be separated and set aside for the Lord. That provision has not been followed or carried out in this new dispensation after the cross. We don't see this. What we do see, though, is this right here. We see in 2 Corinthians 9:7, he says, each one must do just as he has purpose in his heart, not grudgingly. So we're not supposed to give grudgingly with a frown or under compulsion. That's the point. You cannot say that someone has to give a certain amount, but then turn around and say that you don't have to force them to give under certain compulsion. Making a person give at least 10%, that is a compulsion. Now, he says that how you ought to do is you ought to give cheerfully. God loves a cheerful giver, and God is able to make all grace abound to you so that always having all sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance of every good deed. And what God is going to bless you with is not necessarily going to be money.
Ooh, say that loud for the prosperity pastors in the back.
It might be in other areas. And so even when they refer to in the Gospels, give and it shall be given to you, pressed down, shaken forward, shaken together and running over. Again, that's a way that people will put this together to make you say, to kind of guilt you into giving. Will God bless you for giving? Sure. How is it going to bless so? Will it be monetarily? Not necessarily. It might be in other ways. God does want you. Now, let's be clear. God does want us to give. It's the amount in question that's been the source of debate. Give according to this command that Paul gives, or the statement that Paul gives with a cheerful heart. Give out of love. However you purpose, notice what he says, however you have purposed in your heart. Verse 7. So if in your heart you desire to give 14%, that's fine. If you desire to give 4%, if you desire to give 10%, if you desire to actually give a tenth, that is fine if you purpose that in your heart. Where it becomes a problem, and I mentioned earlier, where this can become a danger, if you obligate yourself as a result of the law to give 10%. If you're going to force yourself or say that I have to give 10%, then I would be violating the law. I would be committing a sin if I don't, and I must do this as a result of what the law says. Then what you're doing is you're obligating yourself under the law. And that is a person, if that person has obligated themselves under the law and their salvation is contingent upon them keeping the law, that person cannot be saved. Why do I say so? And this is why it's dangerous. Notice what he says in Galatians 5:4. This is, matter of fact, let's start in verse 3. He says, and I testify again to every man who receives circumcision that he is under obligation to keep the whole law.
Yep, all 613 of them.
You have been severed from Christ, whoever you are, you that are seeking to be justified by the law. You have fallen from grace. And so if there's a person who says they trust in the work of the cross, but then what they really are trusting in is the work of the law, that person has been cut off. What is the work of the law? Trying to keep the law by giving these tithes. Again, it's okay if you decide in your heart, if you purposed in your heart to give a tithe, to give 10% of what, that's fine. Just like if you purpose to give in your heart 8.5%, 12%, that's fine. Now, Paul does say, if that extra 0.2%, if that extra dollar is going to cause you to give a frown, then don't give it. God doesn't need your money. That part should be understood. God doesn't need anything from you, but he does love a cheerful giver. And so if giving $100 keeps you smiling, Amen. If $101 makes you frown, don't give the $101. Don't sin while you're trying to give. You cannot guilt God into doing anything for you, and God is not trying to guilt you. Give according to your heart. Now, should you think about what God has done for you and what you can give? Amen. But don't let someone guilt you into giving something. Give your rent money, give your mortgage money, give your light. No, we're not going to give bill money. We're not going to give the money that's obligated, but give what you can give. Make God a priority as you give. That part is understood. But for someone to make you give a certain percentage, that person's also sinning. Do not participate in that. You do not have to pay a tithe. Do you have to give something? You should give something. That part is also understood. But if you are trying to make it into heaven by keeping all of the law,
Yep, all 613 of them.
you will miss all of heaven because you cannot keep any of it, including the tithe.
I want to play you a clip where Robert Morris tells a congregation of people that Jesus commanded us as Christians to tithe. Yes.
That's your question, all right? If Jesus himself said you ought to tithe, would you tithe? Okay, I'm going to go ask these people over here. Y'all in? Okay. No, I'm just kidding. Let me ask all of you, okay? Campuses, all the churches. If Jesus himself said you ought to tithe, would you tithe? Okay. Here's the sad part. Some of us still have to think about it. That the one that bled and died on the cross, if he said you ought to give 10%, we still have to think about it. Okay, so let me put it another way. If Jesus said it, that you ought to tithe, in the New Testament, in red, would you do it? You want to see the verse? Matthew 23:23, Jesus is speaking. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees.
Excuse me, sir. We are not Pharisees and scribes, but yeah, figure it out.
Hypocrites, for you pay tithe, 10%.
This man is a liar. He just added words to the Bible that's not there. Show me the 10%. Liar.
Of mint, anise, and cumin, those are spices, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. Watch very carefully. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. Okay, here's what Jesus said. You guys give tithes, not only of your first fruits, but you even give tithes of the spices that you're going to put on your food.
Morris, you've just misunderstood what's going on here in this passage. Let me ask you a very basic question. Is Jesus speaking to Christians under the new covenant, or is he speaking to Jews under the old covenant? It's a pretty simple question, and it's very clear in the text. He's speaking to scribes and Pharisees, and so he's speaking to the Jews under the old covenant. The scribes and Pharisees were Jews. They weren't Christians living under the new covenant. So it's very clear here that they ought to have tithe. Yes, absolutely. Jews living under the old covenant ought to have tithe. Very clear argument. Secondly, notice as well that he says that they tithe from their mint, anise, and cumin. These things are spices, most likely from their backyard garden. They've got probably a little herb garden there, and they're so finicky about tithing that they will tithe from the herbs in their garden. But notice it doesn't say anything about tithing money. Nowhere in the Old Testament, or the New Testament for that matter, did anybody tithe from their money. Now, immediately people are thinking, well, back then they had a barter system. That's why they tithed, from the food produce. No. No, they didn't have a barter system. The word money, just in the book of Genesis alone, the word money is used 32 times, just in the book of Genesis. The word shekel is used in the first 5 books of the Bible 32 times, right? So you've got money being used right there in the book of Genesis. Plus you've got the use of the word silver and gold and so forth all over the Old Testament and the New Testament as well. So it's pretty clear that, you know, they were specifically tithing from the produce of the land. And every single command to tithe was about tithing from the produce of the land. It had nothing to do with tithing from your money, no income. You know, if you were a merchant, you didn't have to tithe, right? If you were a fisherman, you didn't have to tithe because, you know, the fish didn't come from the land, they came from the sea, right? So therefore a lot of Jesus' disciples never tithed. If, you know, you were a carpenter, you didn't have to tithe. Why? Because it was something you created with your hands. It was not the produce of the land, the farm produce of the land. Therefore, Jesus never tithed. Jesus paid the temple tax, but he didn't have to tithe. But even the temple tax, he claimed to be exempt from. So, you know, all of these arguments are very easily dismissed here. But notice as well that these scribes and Pharisees were so strict on tithing that they would tithe from the herbs in their herb garden, but they never tithed from their money. They never tithed from their, you know, financial income in terms of money and wages and so forth. They tithed only from the produce of the land. But notice as well that Jesus referred to tithing as the smaller part of the law. So even under the old covenant, right, the greater part of the law was justice, mercy, and faith, and the smaller part of the law was tithing. In chapter 4 pronounces the destruction of the temple, and that's the end of the tithing system. It's over. The tithing system is finished. And no, your church building does not take the place of the temple. Your church building is just a building. There's no church buildings in the New Testament. Not a single reference to a church building anywhere, right? So the idea that we have to bring to this storehouse, this big church building, is not biblical. It's not biblical. The storehouses were Levitical storehouses in the old covenant throughout the cities, right? It wasn't even the temple there, right? So no, your church is not the house of God. The local pastor is not your priest. You know, we are all priests before God. We don't have a priest in between us and Jesus. Jesus is our high priest, and we are all priests. We don't have to pay for the upkeep of the temple anymore.
Final thought, be a cheerful giver and give what you can. That's all I have for you guys today. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and see you on the next video.